I have zero issue with them running at 30 frames per second. And that, like I said, to me personally, in most cases, I would prefer it. If the PlayStation 5 could run Horizon Forbidden West at 120 frames per second, I would still want the game running at 30.
That is possibly gonna be the most autistic thing I've ever fucking heard in my life. And I am autistic. I've listened back to my own fucking videos. I made my own fucking anime intro with the title Autistic Loser, and I'm still not as autistic as this motherfucker. Like, do Sony fanboys just hate getting value for their money? G'day everyone, it's your boy, Jordan CS No here, and welcome back to another cringy ass video on the dark web. And in today's video, we're doing something a little bit different, because we're covering kind of an old video that I just thought would be fun to cover. Which I'm sure some of you would be familiar with this video, but it's just an absolutely brain-dead take, where the dude literally says that 30 FPS is better than 60. However the fuck that works. Now this video comes from SupaNova Gaming, who I've covered in the past on this channel a few times. Like when he said that we should blame Microsoft for the PS5 price increase, or when he just had a mental breakdown over God of War on PC, which was honestly hilarious. But today we're going to be watching somewhat of an old video of his, and in actual fact the first video of his I ever saw, which is titled Why Gamers Shouldn't Focus on 60 FPS Next Generation. Which, this take is just absolutely galaxy-brained, which you would probably know if you've seen it. I mean, the dude literally says that even if he had the option to play at 60 FPS, he'd still choose 30. But anyway, I've been trying to keep these intros short recently, so without further ado, let's just get straight into his video. Lord forgive me for what I am about to do here.
Now, the reason I'm making this video is because I've seen so many people over the last months and weeks say that next generation should be defined by 4K 60. Every game should be native 4K, 60 frames per second, that there's no excuse for games not running at 60 frames per second.
I mean, there really isn't any excuse for Microsoft and Sony's hardware to not run games at 60 frames per second, when PCs have been able to do that for literal generations. And at the time of this video being made, they were comparing their consoles to the 20 series cards. Now thankfully most PS5 games do actually have a 60 FPS option called Performance Mode, which increases frame rate but slightly lowers resolution. Which I've heard from a lot of my friends who have PS5s, that 60 FPS makes a world of difference.
And that they are going to be very upset if they are not seeing games running at 60 frames per second.
You know, I love the not so subtle jab that he takes at people who want the games to be 60 FPS. You know, comparing them to angry children. Like, I mean, how dare you demand more of a product that you're buying, you angry, entitled child?
And I remember there were a few people that were kind of bitching and complaining when the PlayStation 5 event took place, and they found out that most of the PlayStation 5 games shown were not running at 60 frames per second, but were running at 30 frames per second. And while more than likely most of the people airing their grievances were just Xbox fanboys talking shit.
Oh yeah, just Xbox fanboys talking shit, because as we all know, no true Sony fan would ever demand more from the products that they pay for, because, you know, I mean, God forbid that the new generation console gives you a better experience than the last generation console.
I'm sure many of the people were also PlayStation fans thinking to themselves, the PlayStation 5 is supposed to be extremely powerful, why can't it play games at 60 frames per second? And after the event took place, we actually had a former principal software engineer for PlayStation 5 actually explain to us why many of these games were running at 30 frames per second. And it had nothing to do with limitations of the hardware.
Wow, that sentence aged like milk. You know, it's really weird to look back at this when we realize that yes, it absolutely is because of hardware limitations. You know, considering most new PS5 games can't actually do 4K 60. And it's only really upscaled old PS5 games or new ones that have very limited graphical requirements that can.
And more to do with limitations of TVs and developers' decisions based on the HDR capabilities of those TVs. I'll read directly from the article what the guy was saying, but just a heads up, it is kind of techie, garbled nonsense.
You know, I do agree with this, that it is nonsense, but definitely not because it's techie or jarbled.
It may be difficult for you to understand, so I will do my best to explain to you what it is that he's talking about.
Oh, that's good. We have SupaNova here to explain to all us lower IQ individuals how this shit works.
Matt Hargett points out in a tweet that the problem is not with the console, but with players' TVs. He writes that a typical cheap 4K TV can only do 420 HDR at 4K and 60Hz, but can push the HDR to 422 at 4K and 30Hz. Most game developers would rather have their games look good in 4K than have them run at 60 frames per second.
Yeah, let me just call bullshit on that one, because if most developers really cared about having 4K or HDR over 60 frames per second, you would see the same shit with PC games. You know, basically every PC game would be capped at 30 frames per second and have HDR support. But wait, they don't.
And it seems they must sacrifice one or the other.
I really have to wonder how he read this and thought that this wasn't because of hardware limitations, just because they said it wasn't. Because if it was really about people's TVs and not hardware limitations, they would just implement graphical settings, where if your TV couldn't handle it, you could drop the FPS to 30, turn off HDR, or lower the resolution. Like, again, it's just such obvious bullshit, because if it wasn't about hardware limitations, then there would be options. They wouldn't just cap everything at 30.
Now, I'm sure you're able to understand most of that, but the parts you probably didn't understand was the 420 and the 422. Now, I'm going to link a video I found of someone explaining what these numbers mean in the description, because they're going to do a better job of explaining it than I will, but I'm still going to give you like a basic explanation. These numbers referred to as called color sampling. There's 444, 422, and 420. 444 captures the most color information about a particular image. 422 captures half the amount of information, and 420 captures even less information. So if you're using 422, you're going to have a more detailed and colorful picture than if you're running 420. And according to him, many TVs are not able to run 422 at 60 Hz or 60 frames per second. So the developers can either have their games run at 60 frames per second and run 420, which means a less colorful, detailed game, or they can drop it down to 30 frames per second and be able to do 422 and have a much more colorful, detailed picture.
Or again, if it was really the fault of the TV and not the console, they would just have graphical settings, so that people with bad TVs could play on 30 FPS and people with good TVs could play on 60. Like, it literally makes zero sense to punish everybody just because some people bought shitty TVs. Which, by the way, I think we can all tell that this is because Sony were hyping up the PS5 as having 4K 60 on all their new games, but then realized they couldn't deliver it, and tried to play it off as if it's because of people's TVs, which it isn't. So it'd basically be the equivalent of PC game developers saying, oh, well, you know, our new PC games aren't allowed to utilize the 30 series cards, because there's still people that are using the 20 series cards.
The devs are opting to have the better looking game rather than the smoother running game, if that makes sense. He also mentioned the, quote, filmic quality of the games, and how developers wanted to maintain that filmic quality. And this is something I try to explain to people all the time, because me personally, there are certain games that I prefer at 30 frames per second, and that I believe should be at 30 frames per second.
Yeah, let me just tell you guys, anyone who says that they prefer 30 frames over 60 frames has never played a game at 60 frames. And he's only going to further prove my point as this video goes on, as all the games he references at the time of this video being made didn't have a 60 FPS option. And now that they do, you know, 2 years later, everybody says that it makes a world of difference.
Bro, you're so full of shit, you're just damage controlling. 50 flops, yo. 50 flops, yo.
This video really was made in 2020. Although, actually, it wasn't even funny then.
Now, your fighting games, racing games, and first-person shooters, those should be 60 frames or up, because of the types of games that they are. But games that are supposed to be cinematic, your third-person action-adventure games, your The Last of Us, your Uncharted, games like that, where they're supposed to have a very cinematic feel to them.
Yeah, games like Uncharted and The Last of Us. Two games, one of which didn't have a 60 FPS option at the time of this video being made, and the other of which did, and was heavily praised for it, with people saying that the 60 FPS makes a huge difference.
those games for me look better at 30 frames per second because they have that quote-unquote filmic quality. Once you increase the frames per second up to 60, they then lose that. They look a little weird. Do they run smoother? Absolutely. But they lose that cinematic movie-like feel.
Alright, here's a suggestion for you, my friend. If you really want something with that filmic, cinematic quality aspect, whatever it is, okay? You know, you want something that looks and feels cinematic, like a movie with that filmic quality. Go watch a fucking movie. Like, I really don't get this whole thing that PlayStation fanboys say about, oh, Muh Cinema. Like, video games and movies are very different art forms, mainly that you play a video game and you watch a movie. I mean, what? I thought we all just buy video games to watch the cutscenes.
Same thing with like God of War, for example. God of War has the two modes you can choose from. You can choose from the graphics mode or the performance mode. The second you put it in performance mode and it kicks the game up to 60 frames per second, it's buttery smooth, but it loses that filmic quality. It loses that cinematic feel.
Yeah, just one small problem, and that is that God of War 2018 couldn't actually run at a stable 60 frames per second on the PS4 Pro. Although it was above 30 frames per second, which would have put it at more like 40 or 50 frames. However, even in this article, it still says that the performance mode was still much better, and was preferred because of its increased responsiveness. Which is basically the same consensus I get from anyone I know who owned a PS4 and played God of War.
And I'm going to attempt to demonstrate to you exactly what I mean using a clip from the Avengers.
Yeah, and I'm not gonna show that shit because I don't want to get a copyright strike from Disney. Although, the fact that he uses a movie to try and help demonstrate his point only really argues against it because, you know, again, video games and movies are completely different mediums of entertainment.
Now, I would love to be able to show you that same clip running right now on the screen in 60 frames per second. But unfortunately, my limited knowledge of how to use Final Cut Pro since I'm self-taught is making it so I can't upload clips in 60 frames per second. Even though I have the clip saved to my computer in 60 frames per second, when I import it into Final Cut Pro, it automatically drops it to 24 frames per second.
Bruh, the man was trying to talk like a tech expert before and can't even figure out how to use Final Cut Pro. You know, Apple software, which is literally so simple that there's probably 10-year-olds that know how to use it. But even still, you could have just Googled how to do it. Like, it really isn't that hard, or God forbid, you could have checked the project settings and changed them to support 60 FPS. But it's also quite funny that he keeps this in the video when, because he can't show the comparison clip, there's basically no point to including it.
Everything is a little strange. The animations look weird. Everything, it almost looks like it's filmed with an iPhone or a cell phone rather than filmed with a movie camera. The whole cinematic, filmic look to the movie is gone when it's at 60 frames per second. This is the same issue that I have playing video games. When I play some of these games at 60 frames per second, they lose that cinematic feel.
You know, I'd like to ask again why we are comparing films to video games when they're two completely different mediums. Mainly that a film is passive and a game is interactive. I mean, then again, this motherfucker's a Sony fanboy. I suppose I wouldn't really know the difference between them if all I did was play Sony games.
I also think a lot of gamers are being very unrealistic with their expectations going into the next generation. It seems that gamers on both sides, more so on the Xbox side because it is the more powerful machine, but gamers on both sides expect games next gen to all run at native 4K with real-time ray tracing for shadows and reflections and extremely dense detailed environments and all the bells and whistles and do it all at a minimum of 60 frames per second. And I think that is just unrealistic. I think they're expecting way too much of these machines.
Yeah, not gonna lie, that was kind of the fault of two parties, mainly being Microsoft and Sony, the console manufacturers, and the people who took all of that at face value. I mean, don't get me wrong, the PS5 and the Xbox Series X seem like good consoles, but they're not fucking miracles. Like, they can't do all that shit. You know, like run 4K 60 on all games with ray tracing and cure cancer, and end world hunger, and all this other bollocks that they hyped it up to be able to do, and then it didn't end up doing.
The developer's main goal is to make the best looking game possible, not the smoothest running game possible, if that makes sense.
Isn't the developer's goal to make the best playing game possible? You know, since you play a game, not just fucking look at it. But like, does he legitimately think as well that every developer wants to prioritize how the game looks? Just because one Sony executive said it, you know, while they were damage controlling for the fact that the PS5 can't do native 4K 60 frames per second on every new Sony release. Which is a clear distinction to make that I'm talking about new Sony releases. Obviously it can do 4K 60 on old games.
Now, I'm sure there are devs who are going to prioritize smoothness over anything else, and they're going to target that 60 frames per second, and that's going to be mandatory for the game they're trying to make. And those are primarily going to be your first-person shooters, racing games, and fighting games. But I think all the other games, the first-person action-adventure games, your Uncharted's, your Spider-Man's, your Horizon Zero Dawn's, your Fable, if they actually finally unveil Fable, games like that.
Yeah, mostly games which at the time of this video being made didn't have 60 FPS modes, or were praised when they actually got them.
I think that developers are going to target making the game look as good as possible, not necessarily run as smooth as possible.
Yeah, because as we all know, you buy video games to look at them and watch the cutscenes, you know, not play them. Like, who needs the game to run smoothly when you actually fucking play it?
And let's get real for a second.
Oh no, here it comes.
Playing games at 30 frames per second doesn't feel bad. I've never once played a game running at 30 frames per second and thought to myself, fuck man, this game is clunky and slow as shit because it's 30 frames per second. Nah, the game felt fine. Do they feel smoother at 60 frames per second? Of course, but is it a huge, massive deal? Fuck no.
You know, it's funny he says all of this, when he's clearly never experienced all of these games at 60 frames per second. You know, mainly because most games on the PS4 Pro were just capped at 30.
I know those of you who play a lot of online multiplayer first-person shooters are screaming at me in the comments, and listen, I get it, I understand. When it comes to playing first-person shooters online competitively, 60 frames per second should be the minimum because of how much better it is, and how much better your reaction times can be, and how much smoother everything runs. I totally get it. I understand.
You know, he says this, but I get the slightest feeling that he doesn't, in fact, get it. Because it's not like here we're talking about an opinion on a video game. We're talking about something objective, like performance, which can be measured, which objectively 60 frames per second is better than 30 frames per second. And thus games that run at 60 versus 30 will perform and play better at 60. Thus giving you a better gameplay experience, you know, aka the reason you bought the game, to play it.
So for first-person shooters, like I said, and fighting games and racing games, I think it should be 60 frames per second. But for everything else, I have zero issue with them running at 30 frames per second. And that, like I said, to me personally, in most cases, I would prefer it. If the PlayStation 5 could run Horizon Forbidden West at 120 frames per second, I would still want the game running at 30.
Oh, God. Ugh, this one is lost, man. I mean, if ever I needed a case for why God has abandoned humanity, I have it right here. Like, that is possibly gonna be the most autistic thing I've ever fucking heard in my life. And I am autistic. I've listened back to my own fucking videos. I made my own fucking anime intro with the title Autistic Loser, and I'm still not as autistic as this motherfucker. Like, in this scenario, you literally have the choice of, well, do I want the game to perform better or worse? And you've chosen worse. Like, genuine question here. Do Sony fanboys just hate being given good products? Like, do Sony fanboys just hate getting value for their money? Because that's the only fucking explanation I can think of for as to why these motherfuckers are the way they are.
Because anything higher than 30 takes away that cinematic feel from the game.
Again, go to the fucking movies, my guy. But also, how would you know that above 60 FPS takes away that cinematic feel from a game? Like, you haven't even played the games at 60 FPS, and you're judging this based on a movie, when a video game and a movie are completely different.
So, long story short, I don't think the 60 frames per second is the end-all, be-all when it comes to video games next generation. I don't think that 60 frames per second should define whether or not a game is a next generation game.
You know, I kind of agree with that point. I think 60 FPS probably should have been a standard of games from the PS4. But anyway, that's basically where his video ends. And that's gonna be where today's video ends. So, thanks everybody for watching. I know we covered an old video, but I hope you guys enjoyed it nonetheless. So if you guys did enjoy this video, make sure you fucking smash that like button. If you're new to the channel, subscribe, turn on those post notifications so you never miss an upload. And also so I don't find out where you live and force you to click the notification button myself. Haha, just kidding. FBI, don't arrest me. If you have the means to do so and would like to help support the channel, click the join button down below to become a channel member for exclusive perks and more. Follow me on Twitter at JordanCSNo, subscribe to the second channel, JordanCS2, and join the Discord server for updates and more. Links to all of those will be in the description. Please don't send any hate over to SupaNova Gaming. Again, this is an old video. It might not necessarily reflect what he still thinks, I don't know. But it's also just very unneeded. But that's all for today. So until the next one, piss off.